It was the photograph that did it. Not the bones. Not the ashes. Not the empty grave. Not even the name carved into the headstone that had stood for over 100 years, weathered by wind and rain until the letters were barely visible. It was the photograph. July 1923, a faded sepia image tucked inside a leather-bound Bible found in an abandoned cabin on the slopes of a mountain that had no name on any official map. The cabin had stood empty for decades, its roof long since collapsed, its walls held together by nothing but the stubborn will of Appalachian hickory and the memory of whoever had built it. A survey crew from the United States Geological Survey, mapping the border between Kentucky and Virginia for the first time since the Civil War, had stumbled upon it by accident, a forgotten structure so deep in the hollows that even the old-timers in the nearest town had forgotten it existed. The crew chief, a man named Theodore Langford, had pried open the cabin door expecting nothing but rot and rodent nests. Instead, he found a single room, strangely preserved, with a bed frame still standing and a small wooden table against the far wall. On the table lay the Bible. Inside the Bible was the photograph. And in the photograph was a face that would haunt Theodore Langford for the rest of his life. A woman, young, perhaps no more than 25, with dark hair pulled back and a faint smile playing at the corners of her mouth. Her eyes were clear and steady, looking directly into the camera with an expression that suggested she was not afraid of being seen. She wore a simple dress, a high-necked collar, and a brooch at her throat, a small silver brooch in the shape of a leaf. Oak, perhaps, or chestnut. It was hard to tell from the faded image. But that wasn't what made Theodore Langford stop breathing. What made Theodore Langford stop breathing was the fact that he recognized her. He had seen that face before. In another photograph. In a different Bible. In a different cabin, over 100 miles away, in the mountains of West Virginia, where his own grandmother had grown up and where his family had lived for generations. The face was the same. The expression was the same. Even the brooch, the small silver leaf at the throat, was the same. The woman in the photograph was the mirror image of a portrait that had hung in his grandmother's parlor, a portrait of a woman who had died in 1863, a woman who had been buried in the family cemetery, a woman whose grave Theodore had visited every summer since he was a child. But that grave had always bothered him. Not because of anything dramatic. Not because of ghost stories or strange occurrences or any of the Appalachian folklore that his grandmother had loved to tell. No, the grave bothered Theodore Langford for a much simpler reason. The grave had never quite seemed real. The headstone was old, certainly. The dates were carved deep 1825 to 1863, but something about the inscription had always felt wrong. The name was there, Eliza Bethany Cooper. The dates were there, born in Kentucky, died in Virginia. But no cause of death was given, no biblical verse was carved beneath the dates, no mention of being a beloved wife or mother. Just a name, and a span of 38 years, and then nothing. It was, Theodore had always thought, the most sterile grave he had ever seen. A placeholder. A marker of absence rather than presence. He had never been able to shake the feeling that the woman buried beneath that stone was not the woman whose portrait hung in his grandmother's parlor. But he had never been able to prove otherwise. He had never had any reason to believe he was right. Until July 1923, when he pried open an abandoned cabin door on a nameless mountain and found her face staring back at him from inside a stranger's Bible. The discovery would send Theodore Langford on a quest that would take him from the high peaks of the Appalachians to the archives of Washington, D.C., from the memories of his grandmother to the secrets of a war that had torn the nation apart. It would reveal a conspiracy that spanned decades and a crime that had never been properly punished. It would force him to confront the uncomfortable truth that some secrets are buried for a reason, and some debts are never truly paid. But all of that lay in the future. On that July morning, with the Bible open in his hands and the photograph staring up at him, Theodore Langford did what any good surveyor would do: he measured the distance between what he knew and what he suspected. And he found it wanting. So he took the Bible. He took the photograph. And he began to dig. To understand what Theodore Langford found on Burnt Mountain, one must first understand the world in which it all began. The year was 1859. The place was the mountains of eastern Kentucky, in a region that would later be called the dark and bloody ground for the violence that erupted there during the Civil War. The nation was on the brink of fracture, the arguments over slavery and states' rights growing louder by the day, but in the hollows and hollers of the Appalachian frontier, life continued much as it had for generations. Men cleared land and built cabins. Women tended gardens and raised children. Families worshipped in log churches and buried their dead on the hillsides. The mountains were hard, but they were home, and the people who lived there asked nothing more than to be left alone. Eliza Bethany Cooper was one of those people. Born in 1825 in the small community of Connie Creek, Kentucky, she grew up in a family of modest means and unshakable faith. Her father, a farmer and occasional preacher, had taught her to read from the King James Bible, and her mother had passed down the family's oral history, tales of Scottish ancestors who had fled the highlands for the New World, of Cherokee neighbors who had taught them to track deer through the deep woods, of a land that was as beautiful as it was unforgiving. By all accounts, Eliza was a woman of uncommon intelligence and quiet strength. She never married, a fact that had caused some comment in the community but no scandal. Her suitors had been few, and her rejections had been gentle but firm. She had seen too many women her age worn down by poverty and childbirth, too many good men broken by the weight of their own silence. She had chosen instead to teach. The children of Connie Creek learned their letters from Eliza Cooper, their numbers, their geography, their history. She was the closest thing the community had to a schoolteacher, and she took the responsibility seriously. She was also, it turned out, a keeper of secrets. In the summer of 1859, a stranger arrived in Connie Creek. He was a tall man, broad-shouldered, with a beard that didn't quite hide the scar on his jaw. He claimed to be a traveling preacher, an itinerant Methodist circuit rider, making his way through the mountains to bring the word to scattered congregations. He stayed for a few days, preaching in the log church, eating at the tables of the faithful, and he left as quietly as he had come. But before he left, he had a conversation with Eliza Cooper. The conversation took place in the churchyard, after the Sunday service. What was said between them, no one ever knew for certain. But the stranger gave Eliza something, a small bundle wrapped in oilcloth, and she gave him something in return. A letter, perhaps, or a promise. Whatever it was, it would have consequences that no one could have foreseen. Within weeks, the stranger was dead. Murdered, the local authorities said, by a gang of horse thieves who had robbed him and left his body in a ditch on the road to Virginia. The murder was never solved. No one was ever charged. The stranger's belongings were sold at auction, a few clothes, a worn Bible, a saddle, and the matter was quietly forgotten. But Eliza Cooper did not forget. She had been the one to identify the body. She had been the one to arrange for a proper burial. She had been the one to write to the man's family, informing them of his death and sending his personal effects alone. And she had been the one to notice, when she was cleaning out his saddlebags, that the letter she had given him was missing. Not stolen. Not lost. Missing. It had been taken from his belongings before they had been sold, before they had been sent to his family. Someone had searched the stranger's possessions and removed what they had found. Someone who knew what to look for. Someone who was willing to kill to find it. Eliza Cooper understood at that moment that the stranger had not been killed by horse thieves. He had been killed by someone who knew the truth about his real purpose in coming to Connie Creek. And that same someone was still out there, still searching, still willing to commit murder to protect their secret. So Eliza did what any intelligent woman would do. She gathered what she knew, what she suspected, what she had been told, and she hid it. She wrote it all down in a leather-bound journal, which she sealed inside a tin box and buried beneath the foundation of her cabin. She told no one what she had done. She told no one what she knew. She simply waited, and watched, and kept her silence. And then the war came. The Civil War tore through the Appalachian Mountains like a fever, leaving death and destruction in its wake. Kentucky, officially neutral at first, became a battleground between Union and Confederate sympathizers, neighbor against neighbor, brother against brother. The mountains were a no-man's land, a place where armies came to die and where families were torn apart by the violence of their own divided loyalties. Eliza Cooper survived the war, but not without cost. Her father died of fever in 1861. Her mother followed him in 1863. Her community was shattered by the conflict, families scattered, homes burned, fields left untended. By the time the war ended in 1865, Connie Creek was a shadow of what it had been. But the secrets that Eliza had hidden beneath her cabin, secrets she had written down in that leather-bound journal, remained undisturbed. The war had taken the men who might have found them. The violence had driven away the strangers who might have searched for them. The mountains, it seemed, had done what they were best at, keeping their own counsel. In 1863, however, something happened that would change the course of Eliza Cooper's life forever. The war was still raging. The Confederacy was still fighting. And in the mountains of eastern Kentucky, a group of men calling themselves the Home Guard, a local militia affiliated with the Union, had grown increasingly aggressive in their pursuit of Confederate sympathizers. They were not regular soldiers. They were vigilantes, men who used the chaos of war as cover for their own private grievances. One night in October, they came to Eliza Cooper's cabin. She knew why they had come. In the years since the stranger's murder, she had continued to teach, continued to write, continued to keep her own counsel. But she had also learned something. The stranger had not been killed by horse thieves. He had been killed by someone with ties to the Home Guard. Someone who had learned that the stranger was carrying information that would have exposed the Guard's leaders as collaborators with Confederate forces, traitors to the Union they professed to serve. The information Eliza had written in her journal was the only evidence that existed. And the men who had killed the stranger knew that. That night in October, the Home Guard did not find the journal. They searched Eliza's cabin, they questioned her, they threatened her, but they did not find the journal hidden beneath the floorboards. And they left, frustrated, promising to return. But Eliza knew that her luck would not hold forever. So she made a decision. She gathered the photographs, the one from the stranger, the one she had kept of herself, and she wrote a final entry in her journal. Then she took them to a place she knew, a cabin high on the slopes of a mountain that had no name, and she hid them there. Inside the cabin, she placed the photograph of herself, the Bible that had been the stranger's, and a letter that would explain everything to anyone who found it. And then she went home to wait. The Home Guard returned a week later. They did not threaten her this time. They did not question her. They simply took her out into the woods, and they shot her in the back, and they left her body where it fell. They buried her hastily, in an unmarked grave on a hillside, and they told the rest of the community that she had died of a fever. No one questioned the story. No one dared. The war was over, but the violence had not ended. And the families of the Appalachian Mountains had learned to keep their heads down and keep their mouths shut. But someone did know the truth. Someone had found the journal. Someone had read the entries. Someone had understood that Eliza Cooper had hidden more than just a letter, she had hidden a story. And that person had kept the secret for 60 years. Theodore Langford was that someone's grandson. The woman in the photograph, the woman whose face he recognized from his grandmother's parlor, was not his grandmother. She was someone else entirely, a stranger, a mystery, a ghost. And the journal he found inside his grandmother's things after she died in 1921 was not her journal. It was Eliza Cooper's. The journal told the whole story. The stranger's arrival, his murder, Eliza's decision to hide the evidence of what she knew, the Home Guard's attack, her final flight to the cabin on Burnt Mountain. It also told something else, something Theodore had never suspected, something that would shake the foundations of his understanding of his own family. The man who had murdered the stranger, the leader of the Home Guard, was Theodore's great-grandfather. Thomas Langford, a farmer from the next valley over, a respected community leader, a deacon in the church, the very man whose portrait also hung in Theodore's grandmother's parlor, had been the one who gave the order to shoot the stranger and the one who had eventually given the order to shoot Eliza Cooper. He had been protecting his own secrets, the secret that he had been a Confederate spy operating under cover of the Union, that he had betrayed his neighbors to the enemy, that he had used the chaos of war to settle old scores and enrich himself at the expense of the dead. And when Eliza Cooper had discovered the truth, when she had written it down and hidden it where no one would find it, Thomas Langford had made sure she would never speak it aloud. He had killed her. And he had gotten away with it. But he hadn't gotten away with everything. The journal was proof. The photographs were proof. The letter Eliza had written in her final days, the one she had left with the Bible and the photograph in the cabin on Burnt Mountain, was proof. Thomas Langford had killed a woman who had done nothing but try to protect herself and her community. He had stolen her life, her future, her chance to leave a mark on the world. And then he had covered it up, had pretended she had died of a fever, had erected a headstone in the family cemetery with her name and her dates and nothing else. The grave Theodore had visited every summer of his childhood was a lie. The woman buried beneath that stone was not the woman whose portrait hung in the parlor. That woman, Eliza Cooper, was buried somewhere else, her body hidden, her true story erased. But her photograph had survived. Theodore Langford's grandmother had kept a copy of that photograph, the same photograph Theodore had found in the cabin on Burnt Mountain. She had kept it as a reminder of the woman who had taught her to read, who had given her a sense of purpose, who had been murdered by the man whose name she bore. She had kept the secret for 6 decades, waiting until the last of Thomas Langford's generation had died, waiting until she herself was too old to be threatened, waiting until the truth could finally be told. And now it had been. Theodore Langford had uncovered the secret that his grandmother had guarded for a lifetime. He had found the proof of a murder that had gone unpunished for over half a century. He had discovered the truth about his own family, the violence, the betrayal, the blood that had been spilled on the mountain. But he still had one question left unanswered. What had been in the letter? The letter Eliza Cooper had written in her final days, the one she had hidden with the Bible and the photograph in the cabin on Burnt Mountain, was addressed to no one and everyone. It was a confession, a testament, a final plea for justice. But it was also something else. It was a key. In the letter, Eliza had written not just the story of the stranger's murder, but the location of something else, something she had hidden in a place even more secret than the cabin on Burnt Mountain. Something she had thought she would never use. She had hidden the stranger's mission. The stranger had not been a preacher. He had been an agent, sent by the United States government to secure a route through the Appalachian Mountains that could be used to supply Union forces in the event of war with the Confederacy. He had been mapping passes, noting locations of strategic importance, identifying families who could be trusted to support the Union cause. And when he had discovered that Thomas Langford was a Confederate spy, he had made a fatal mistake. He had told Eliza Cooper the truth. She had hidden the map. She had hidden the information he had gathered. She had hidden the letters from his superiors in Washington that proved he was working on behalf of the federal government. And she had hidden them in a place she had never told anyone about, a cave deep in the mountains, a cave she had discovered as a child, a cave that held the remains of Native American shelters and artifacts and the bones of animals that had been extinct for centuries. The cave was a place of secrets, and Eliza Cooper had made it hers. In her final letter, she had described how to find the cave. She had drawn a crude map in the margins of the journal, a map that showed the location of the entrance and the path to the chamber where she had hidden her secrets. And she had hoped, desperately, that someday someone would find the letter and use it to bring the truth to light. But no one had found the letter. Not for 60 years. Not until Theodore Langford found the Bible in the cabin on Burnt Mountain. In the fall of 1923, Theodore Langford returned to the mountains of eastern Kentucky. He was older now, wiser, less certain of his own understanding of the world. The discovery of his family's secrets had shaken him to the core, and he was determined to find the truth, no matter where it led. He had told no one where he was going. He had told no one what he had found. He had simply packed his bag, collected his equipment, and made the long journey back to the land of his ancestors. He found the cave exactly where Eliza Cooper's letter said it would be, hidden behind a waterfall, accessible only by a narrow ledge that clung to the side of a cliff. He had to crawl through a tight passage, his lantern flickering in the damp air, before he finally emerged into a chamber that had not been touched by human hands in over half a century. The chamber was small, perhaps 10 feet across, its walls covered with ancient paintings of animals and hunters that must have been thousands of years old. In the center of the chamber was a stone cairn, carefully constructed, with a small wooden box placed on top. The box contained everything Theodore had hoped to find. Letters from the stranger's superiors in Washington, confirming his mission and his instructions. Maps of the passes and trails that would one day form the backbone of the Appalachian frontier. A leather-bound notebook filled with the stranger's observations and discoveries. And a series of letters written by Eliza Cooper, describing in painful detail her life, her fears, and her ultimate fate. But there was something else in the box. A photograph. It was a picture of Thomas Langford, Theodore's great-grandfather, taken just before the war. He was young, handsome, ambitious, his eyes shining with a light that had long since faded. He was standing with his wife, Theodore's great-grandmother, and their young daughter, who would grow up to be Theodore's grandmother. But the photograph wasn't the secret. The secret was what was written on the back. In careful, precise handwriting, someone had written a single line. "The debt is not forgiven." It was dated 1863. The year Eliza Cooper had been killed. Theodore Langford spent the rest of his life trying to make sense of what he had found. He wrote letters. He conducted interviews. He combed through archives and court records and family histories. He spoke to anyone who might know anything about the events of 1859 and 1863, anyone who might remember the stranger, anyone who might have heard rumors of what happened to Eliza Cooper. But the truth was already lost. The men who had murdered the stranger were long dead. The Home Guard had disbanded after the war, its members scattered to the winds. The families who had known Eliza Cooper had died out, their memories buried with them. And the mountains themselves had kept their silence, refusing to give up their secrets to anyone who might seek them. What Theodore did find, however, was more disturbing than he had anticipated. The letter Eliza had hidden in the cabin on Burnt Mountain was not the only letter she had written. She had written many letters, sent to friends and family members, trying to warn them of what was coming, trying to prepare them for the violence that would sweep through the mountains. But most of those letters had never been delivered. They had been intercepted, destroyed, suppressed by the very people who had murdered her. The woman who had been the closest thing to a teacher in the mountains had been silenced in the most effective way imaginable, her words had been erased from the world. And no one had ever known. Theodore Langford published his findings in a small booklet, printed at his own expense and distributed to libraries and historical societies across the region. He called it The Ghosts of Burnt Mountain, and he hoped that someone, somewhere, would read it and remember the woman who had been killed for the crime of telling the truth. But the world did not care. The Great Depression was coming. The war in Europe was looming. The old wounds of the Civil War had long since scabbed over, and few people had the inclination to reopen them. The booklet sold poorly, was reviewed sparingly, and was soon forgotten. By the time Theodore Langford died in 1946, he had accomplished almost nothing. But he had done one thing that mattered. He had kept the photograph. He had passed it down to his children, and they had passed it down to theirs. And today, more than a century after Eliza Cooper's death, the photograph still exists, a ghostly image of a woman whose face has been seen by generations but whose story has been told by almost no one. It is a small thing, a faded sepia image in a worn leather frame. But it is also a testament to a truth that the mountains have kept hidden for far too long. And that truth is simple. Eliza Bethany Cooper, schoolteacher, keeper of secrets, murdered for the crime of speaking the truth, is not forgotten. The dead is not forgiven. And the ghosts of Burnt Mountain still wait for the day when their story will finally be told. Theodore Langford never found out why the stranger gave Eliza Cooper a photograph of herself, or why she kept a copy for so many years, or why his grandmother had chosen to preserve that image above all others. He never found out who wrote the line on the back of Thomas Langford's photograph, "The dead is not forgiven," or what it meant, or why it was left in the cave where Eliza had hidden her secrets. He never found out why the mountain was called Burnt Mountain, or what had burned there, or who had started the fire. He never found out what happened to Eliza's mother, who had died in 1863, or her father, who had died in 1861, or the community that had supported her, or the family that had failed to protect her. He never found out what became of the stranger's mission, or whether the Union had ever made use of his information, or whether the war had been won in the mountains as well as on the battlefields. He never found out why Eliza Cooper had chosen to hide her secrets in a cave, or why she had left the photograph and the Bible on Burnt Mountain, or why she had trusted no one with the truth. And he never found out whether the ghosts of Burnt Mountain would ever rest. The last words of his booklet, the words that have haunted me since I first read them, are these: "The mountain keeps its own counsel. It always has. And I suspect it always will." It is 2026, and the photograph of Eliza Cooper sits on my desk as I write these words. I found it in a box of my grandfather's things, along with a copy of Theodore Langford's booklet and a journal that had belonged to my great-grandmother. The journal, carefully preserved and annotated in my grandfather's handwriting, contains not only Eliza Cooper's story but also the story of Theodore's own quest to uncover the truth. He never succeeded, not entirely. But he came close. He found the cave. He found the letters. He found the map. And he found the photograph of Thomas Langford, with its damning inscription, hidden in a place that no one had known about for over 60 years. The deaths of Burnt Mountain have not been forgotten. The ghosts of that place, the woman who died for telling the truth, the stranger who died for knowing too much, the family that destroyed itself through betrayal and violence, still linger in the hollows and hollers of the Appalachian frontier. And I can't help wondering, what would Eliza Cooper think of the world she left behind? Would she be proud of the way we tell her story? Would she be grateful that her face, her voice, her truth have survived, preserved in a faded sepia photograph and a leather-bound journal and a memory that has been passed down from generation to generation? Or would she be angry? Angry that her story was suppressed for so long, that her murder was never solved, that the men who killed her got away with it and lived out their lives in peace? I don't know. I don't know what Eliza Cooper would think, or what she would want, or what she would say if she could speak to us from beyond the grave. All I know is that her image still haunts me. The dark hair. The steady eyes. The faint smile at the corner of her mouth. The small silver brooch at her throat. She is not forgotten. But the debt that was not forgiven, the debt that was passed down from generation to generation, the debt that can never be paid, still remains. And the ghosts of Burnt Mountain still wait. Waiting for someone to tell their story. Waiting for someone to give them peace. Waiting for someone to finally answer the question that Theodore Langford asked, but never solved. What did Eliza Cooper write in her final letter that was so dangerous, so damning, so important that the men who murdered her were willing to do anything to suppress it? The letter that was lost. The letter that was hidden. The letter that, even now, is still waiting to be found. The answer lies, perhaps, not in the journal or the photograph or the letters but in the land itself. The Appalachian Mountains are a place of secrets, not because the people who live there are secretive, but because the land is so vast and so ancient that it has a memory of its own. The mountains remember everything, from the first Native American tribes to the European settlers to the soldiers who fought and died in the Civil War. They remember the families that were torn apart by violence, the communities that were destroyed by greed, the women who were silenced for speaking the truth. And they remember Eliza Cooper. The woman whose face stares out from a faded photograph, her eyes steady, her lips curved in a faint smile. The woman who died for telling the truth. The woman whose story has only just begun to be told. On a cold October night in 1863, a woman was shot in the back in the mountains of eastern Kentucky. She had done nothing wrong. She had told the truth. She had refused to be silent. And for that, she had been killed. Her body was buried in a secret grave, her story was erased from history, her voice was silenced for over 60 years. But she is not forgotten. The photograph of Eliza Cooper still exists, passed down from generation to generation, preserving her image for all time. The journal still exists, hidden in a cave, waiting to be read by someone who cares. The truth still exists, buried beneath the mountains, waiting to be uncovered. And the debt that was not forgiven, the debt that can never be paid, still remains. The ghosts of Burnt Mountain are still waiting. And as long as they wait, Eliza Cooper's story will never truly end. The mountains keep their own counsel. But sometimes, just sometimes, they speak.